Hello and welcome everybody to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together about 60,000 Christian doctors and dentists from 107 affiliated national movements worldwide. And today on ICMDA webinars, our 227th since the beginning of COVID, we've got Dr. Stephen Willing back on the subject of empty cradles, empty nurseries. So, as of reading from the same script, both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal ran feature-length articles recently on the plummeting birth rates of the advanced Euro-American and East Asian nations. This phenomenon has been known for some time and continues to grow. Why is it a problem? What are the causes? What are the solutions? Dr. Stephen Willing is an academic neuroscientist with over 40 years of clinical experience in academic and private settings. He's currently a consultant in radiology at Tenwick Hospital in Kenya. He's also a pediatric neuroradiologist for Children's of Alabama, a visiting scholar with reasons to believe, and an adjunct professor of divinity at Regent University. Dr. Willing is the author of Atlas of Neuroradiology and more recently Superbia, The Perils of Pride, The Power of Humility. His personal blog on science apologetics, The Soggy Spaniel, may be found at www.swilling.com. Now, Dr. Stephen, it's a real pleasure to have you back on ICMDA webinars, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say and to engaging with you in discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I hope this is helpful to you and your many listeners. This is a subject, as you mentioned, a couple of months ago, two major U.S. newspapers ran feature-length articles on this issue. They're not the first ones to report. This is an issue that's been talked about extensively, although it's variable to what degree this reaches the public consciousness. Some people are aware, some people are probably not aware. Some people are aware but don't think it's an issue. Over the next half hour or so, I'll try and go through, address some of these topics. This is just a general outline of what I'm going to do. I'm going to first run through a series of charts and graphs showing what we're exactly talking about, the data, how there is a global decline in human fertility. Next, I'll try and briefly go through what are some of the consequences. Why should we care? Why is this even a problem? Next, I'll review briefly what has been done by various nations to address this and whether that is even working. So next, if we're talking about having more children, who's going to have these children? That's a very germane question. Next, is there a lot of reasons have been proposed. Many just focus on the economic aspects of this, but I specifically in my article recently raised another question. Maybe it has more to do with marriage and male-female relationships than economics. And then we'll wrap it up with some concluding comments. So first, what are we talking about? In my article, I quoted the New York Times, which said in South Korea, which has the lowest birth rate in the world at 0.72 children per woman, just over 1 million babies were born in 1970. Last year in 2023, 230,000 were. So that was over a 75% decline from 54 years ago. Normally, you expect populations to increase in time. You expect birth rates to increase over time, and they've seen the exact opposite. At the same time, in April of this year, the U.S. fertility hit a historic low of 1.62 births per woman. And while this is often portrayed as a recent phenomenon, the greatest drop in fertility really happened, at least as far as the U.S. concerned, in the late 60s and early 70s, after oral contraception and abortion became widely available. Since 1980, the U.S. rate remained fairly constant, although mostly below replacement here. But in more recent years, we've seen a further decrease. And what happened in the 60s and 70s, that was a time of widespread availability of abortion, the introduction of the birth control pill, and aggressive attempts to decrease overpopulation. There was a lot of talk in that time period about the looming population bomb, was a title of one of the famous books of that era. So parenthood is in decline. And as I mentioned, if over the US from about 1980 to about 2005, it remained fairly constant, but this zooms in on the more recent years, showing in the US that the rate has declined. And we've seen this in other countries as well. Instead of just stabilizing at a lower rate, in recent years, they're declining even further and faster. And in the latter half of this presentation, I'll try and look at what may have changed and what could be driving this more recent decline. So let me say it's mathematically obvious that to keep a population constant, women need to have on average slightly over 2 children per mother. It can't be exactly 2 because you have to take into account some children either die before reaching reproductive age or for whatever reason will never bear children themselves. So you have to have a little buffer. Well, when birth rates fall below replacement, it's possible to keep the population stable for quite some time, either by increasing life expectancy, which would happen on a global level, or through immigration, which has kept the population in the US fairly high for the last few decades. Of course, immigration has no effect on the global population. In the last few decades, most Asian and Western European countries have been well below 2.1 births per female, meaning that ultimately, when deaths begin to outnumber births and without sizable immigration, the population starts to decline. This has been true for some time in Russia, Italy, South Korea, and more recently, China entered into a state of population decline. So this global chart shows the total fertility rate. Everything in white is at 2 to 2.2. Everything that is shaded blue is below replacement rate. Only the orange and red countries have fertility rates above the replacement rate. So you see it's almost everywhere except Africa and South Central Asia. We're seeing below fertility, below replacement rate levels. Now, they were saying that the global population might start to flatten out by the end of this century, but projections are pulling this deadline forward. If we look at the global fertility rate, so taking all the countries around the world and averaging it together, all the countries, the global fertility rate here is the blue line. And where we are right now, it's just barely above 2. This is worldwide. So red is sub-Saharan Africa. Most advanced countries are below replacement. But this blue line, and this article published in Lancet in May of this year, comes from the University of Washington, the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. So it's a very esteemed research group. They predict that we actually will cross over by 2030. So only 6 years out, almost 5 years out, the global fertility rate may drop below replacement. Now, it takes generations for the population to actually start to decline, because as long as more people are being born than are dying, the population stays the same. It only starts to decrease when deaths begin to exceed births. And that's exactly what is happening across many nations. This is a diagram of the European continent. And in the green, they have more births than deaths in 2018. In the red, more deaths than births in 2018. So most of Europe is now in negative population growth. They have more deaths than births. Again, immigration is not factored into this. So the population may or may not decrease depending on the degree of immigration. Now let's look for a second at China. For many decades now, it has been the most populous country in the world. They passed 1 billion many, many years ago, and this was expected to continue. But in the recent years, there's been a rapid decline in the birth rates, but this is not looking at birth rates. This is looking at actual population. And this is looking at the change in population. So up until 2 years ago, it was still continuing to increase, but 3 years ago, it flattened out. 2 years ago, it dropped below. So there's actually a decrease in Chinese population, and it fell again in 2023 by another 2 million people. And this trend is predicted to continue. I mean, a country that size, no amount of immigration is really going to make a dent So this is the picture. Why do we care? Why is this a problem? Well, there are many reasons for being concerned about this. The one that gets most talked about, and for good reason, is that you develop a mismatch between the elderly and the working age population. If you have a large elderly population, the older population requires more intensive health care. They require more services. They may require more home care. They may require assistance with daily living. So they place a lot of demand on services, and the working age population to sustain this gets smaller and smaller. So instead of having 10 workers for every retiree, you're down to 5 or 3 or 2 workers for every retiree. This leads to labor shortages. Ultimately, with loss of population, cities, schools, towns become abandoned, and you don't have the resources to maintain the infrastructure. On a personal and social level, we experience greater loneliness and depression because one of the most important protection against loneliness is the nuclear family, extended family. So the brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins. And with single or no child families, people are deprived of this. And there are many scholars who think this is a major factor into the increasing levels of despair that we are experiencing globally. I can just show you a few headlines here. Wall Street Journal: Singapore's aging population poses economic pressure even as labor market improves. Illustrated, this was in the Wall Street Journal just about 2 weeks ago. This comes out of Lancet in May of this year. The title of the article is Global Fertility with Forecasted 2100. And this doesn't mean necessarily that poverty will increase, but what they are looking at are the fertility rates by population. And the fertility rate continues to, if we look at, say, presently, something under 20% of the global births are in low income. Well, the proportion is going to be lower income is going to be significantly higher as we proceed towards the end of the 21st century. So this shows what can happen if the population decline more severely impacts the more economically productive regions of the world. As time goes on, the lower income populations make up a larger and larger share of global births. And again, this doesn't mean there are more poor people. It's actually been the reverse since 1950, because low income today is way better off than low income was in 1950. The economists are gravely concerned over the consequences of this. More headlines from the Wall Street Journal: Australia's birth rate hits rock bottom with severe consequences for economic future. Again, French baby bust adds to concerns over Europe's graying population. And people will be lonelier. And Japan, in the first 6 months of 2024, 28,330 people died alone. But in 4,921 of these cases, it was 2 weeks or more before anyone even noticed. So people are dying alone in apartments, and their deaths are going unnoticed. There's even a term for this in Japanese. It's the kodokushi, the lonely death. And this is very problematic. Usually these people are socially isolated and living alone. And again, I mentioned if everyone only has one child or no child, you have no brothers, no sisters, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins. And family connections are highly correlated with emotional and social well-being. Ultimately, populations will begin to collapse. This is a screenshot from birthgap.org, the documentary that has been produced, and it shows the population decay per generation. On the top, we look at the fertility rate. So I said maintenance is 2.1. So how much population decay per generation happens? Well, South Korea now is below 0.9. According to this projection, after one generation, there's a 55% decrease in population, 2 generations, 82%, and 3 generations, over 90%. So this would predict that by the end of this century, South Korea will be less than 10% of the population that it is today. No, this was from the New York Times a couple of years ago. American women are having fewer children than they want. And even as desired fertility is rising, birth rates are falling. So what do we get from this slide? What we're saying is it's not necessarily that women are not wanting to have children. This is just looking at Americans, but the average, we take the whole population and average, women say they want 2.7 children. This is as recently as 2015, but they would probably have fewer. And the gap between how many they want to have and how much they probably will have has risen to the highest level in 40 years. So it's not necessarily a lack of desire among young women to have children. But suppose they don't want to have children, and suppose they make this choice not to have children. How many regret this later on? The Pew Research, another major US research organization, published a major study in this year, and they looked at among childless women over 50, 38% had wanted to have children. Another 25% weren't sure. Only 32% never wanted to have children. So still a plurality, possibly even a majority of these women wanted to have children, regret not having children. And another study, this is an original article from Women's Health Issues. They interviewed 5,410 childless women between 2006 and 2010 and published in the US in 2014. And in their study, over 86% of childless women had wanted to have a child. And of course, this decreases with age for a couple of reasons. There's a filtering out effect because a lot of the women who want to have a baby end up having a baby, so they cease to be childless, so they drop off the chart. So by the time you hit 39 or 42, a higher proportion of those who want to have children have gone on and had children. So you're left with a higher share of the ones who never wanted to have children. So what do we get out of this? Still, almost at every age up until the end of fertile years, the majority of women wanted to have children, but the proportion who actually had one is significantly below that. There's certainly here a gap between the desire of women to have children and their success in having children. So what's going on here? Why are all these women who want to have children not having children? And this has been really the crux of the issue and the focus of all this debate and discussion. Well, governments have tried to address this through public policy. Japan has initiated free daycare and paid family leave. Hungary and Norway have liberal financial incentives. Poland and France have liberal cash benefits. Italy, a few years ago, declared a National Fertility Day, and this was very poorly received. There was a lot of pushback and anger. One of my favorites is a public campaign in Denmark with these signs saying, "Do it for Denmark." I don't know why it's in English, but it is. But does this have any impact? Well, it has very little impact. The Wall Street Journal said, imagine if having children came with more than $150,000 in cheap loans, a subsidized minivan, and a lifetime exemption from income taxes. That happened in Hungary. Would people have more kids? The answer, it seems, is no. Now, Hungary and Norway devote more resources to families than almost any other nation, and their fertility rates remain below replacement at 1.5 and 1.4, respectively. So does public policy have an impact? Well, probably does, but it has a negative impact. China is famous for their one-child policy, abandoned only recently. That was highly effective in driving down the birth rates. U.S. has a very liberal abortion policy in place since the 1970s and we've seen a dramatic decline in birth. After World War II, Japan and South Korea were very concerned about overpopulation and aggressively promoted contraception and abortion. So the New York Times concluded that governments can change fertility rates, but generally only in one direction, down. So who is to have these children? let's state the obvious. Only women within a certain age range, say 16 or 18 up to about 35 or 40. Now, we divide the female population in various ways. We can look at married versus unmarried, childless, which is women who want to have children, versus child-free, the ones who didn't want to have children. If we look at just the child-free women, they are more likely to be unmarried and politically liberal, at least in the US. So why are we seeing this? And as I said in the article, I said underpopulation is overdetermined, and science overdetermined means there are a lot of possible causes, and any one or all of them may be causative and resulting in the effect that is described. Is it an economic cost? That's what you'll hear about most often. The most common explanation for not having kids is going to be economic. We're always told that the rising cost of having children is the major obstacle, yet this runs counter to almost all the evidence. A declining birth rate is strongly correlated to increasing wealth on a population-wide scale, and offering financial incentives to mothers has had negligible effect. Many of the expenses associated with raising children really are discretionary. We have a lot of latitude in how much we spend on schooling or housing or technology or clothing. Yes, housing costs are really high. They've skyrocketed in recent years in many, many nations, but you still got to live somewhere. There's no hard and fast rule that children can't share a bedroom, yet in the US at least, today's average home is 60% larger than it was in 1970 with fewer occupants. For those in the lowest income category, maybe cash benefits could have a marginal impact on their decision to have children, but that's really hard to prove. So possibly, and perhaps even likely, the primary cost involved in raising children is not economic, but what I call hedonic. The expense of raising children shows up in lost career options, restricted travel and recreational opportunities, an investment of time, and an acceptance of responsibility. And many just don't care to forego the immediate gratification for the long-term benefits of parenthood. Don't take my word for it, take their word for it. Here's an article, The Rise of the Dinks. Dinks is double income, no kids. Childless, happy, and wealthy. And we see these articles all the time. I read the London Times. They just call it the Times. But I've seen a series of articles in the last couple of years about how happy these older women are that they never had children, or how they regret having had the children. And it's very unhelpful to have this sort of narrative being thrust upon the population. But there is even a more aggressive bunch, and these are the anti-natal folks, the people who say no one should have kids ever, and some of them are parents. This article is from today.com, and because of concerns, perhaps misguided concerns over the environment or just the general angst and agony of life, some people feel like it would be better if the human race disappeared. They're very upfront about their motivations. That's a subject for a whole nother talk that I'm not going to get into today. So kind of summing up, what are some of the barriers then to childbearing? Well, cultural messaging, like I talked about, the hedonism, the antinatalism, all the people are still talking about overpopulation, even though that's been really clearly debunked. It hasn't left the mainstream narrative. People don't know that it's been debunked. Infertility is certainly one. I mean, some people are just unsuccessful at having children. Obviously, non-heterosexual identity, LGBTQ population, whether it's increasing or decreasing is kind of debatable. But when people identify that way, obviously these are non-fertile pairings that are not going to lead to offspring. But for many people, it's just much more mundane, the lack of a suitable partner. I think this is especially acute among the fertile female population. Our political environment, and along with social media, seems to be increasing polarization between men and women, so that younger adults are less likely to find a suitable partner. In the US, young men are becoming kind of more and more hard right, and young women more and more hard left, and they're at a tension with one another. and don't even want to relate to one another. Now, this is an interesting slide. So is it just that women are not having children, or are they having smaller families? Now, there's this documentary out called Birth Gap, which they strongly make the case that it's just childlessness, that it's women. They argue that women who become mothers tend to have the same number of children as past generations. So they show this scale with equilibrium. And what they're saying here is that in Japan in 1974, only 1 in 20 women were childless by the time they ended their period of fertile years, whereas today 1 in 3 enter late adulthood, middle age childless. So there's a dramatic increase in the number of childless, arguing that that of women who become mothers, who actually do have children, it's pretty much remains equally distributed between those who have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or more. Now, that's kind of arguable. I haven't been able to see their data, and there are a lot of other sources that say women who have children are having fewer children, that there are a lot more one-child families than there would have been in past decades. But I think it's really a factor, a combination of both, increasing numbers of women who have no children and smaller family sizes as well. Oh, let's go back here. Interestingly, in the early 1970s, when this was done, 1 in 3 Japanese pregnancies ended in abortion, by the way, because the makers of this documentary attribute it to economic shocks. Well, I find that implausible. Pew Research, I cited them earlier. They have another major study, reasons for women not wanting children. So the women under 50 who don't want children. So this is just a subset of the ones who could have children. The major reason is they just don't want to. They're allowed multiple answers. So 44% wanted to focus on other things, 38% concerns about the state of the world. About 1/4 of these just said that they haven't found the right partner, but they could have had other answers as well. So infertility and haven't found the right partner are kind of low in this group, but this is a small subset of the fertile women who are not having children. If we look at all the women over 50 who did not have children, we see a somewhat different picture. 39% just said it never happened. 33% never found the right partner. Only 31% didn't want to. And infertility or other medical reasons, 15%. So we'll assume here that 69% wanted to. We see a lot of numbers in this area of adult, mature middle-aged women who never had children. What are the reasons, and did they want to or not want to? But overall, the preponderance of evidence is that most of them did want to have children and regret that they were not able to have children. And the most common reasons are pretty much lack of opportunity or inability to become pregnant. When we look at these childless women over 50, they're much more likely to have never married, more likely to have graduated from college, and more likely to be employed. So the next few minutes, I want to look at this link. Well, what's the connection? If you're going to have who's going to have the babies? Is it going to be unmarried single women? All the data seems to indicate that that's a non-starter, that you're not going to make much headway by having single women have more kids. There's a strong connection with marriage. That's what I'm going to be looking at for the next few minutes. So in an early era, this would have been self-evident. Childbirth and marriage are strongly connected. But after the sexual revolution, marriage and childbearing became so dissociated in the public mind that this seemed not merely counterintuitive, but radical. The Times reported how Japan in recent years has intentionally acted to promote marriage. So when we look at Japan, and I said they're not just looking at economic things, they're kind of realizing this is a factor, and they're actually actively trying to promote marriage. But they noted last year, fewer than 500,000 couples got married in Japan, the lowest number since 1933. despite polls showing that most single men and women would like to do so. So what's going on? Why are people not getting married? In October of 1922, the Institute for October of 2022, the Institute for Family Studies published a comprehensive report on the connection between marriage and fertility. And drawing from a number of international databases, they found first that the odds of marriage increase upon childbirth and the odds of childbirth increase upon marriage. So if people get married, they're much more likely to have kids. But if a woman has a kid, she's much more likely to get married after that. So they're connected in both directions. The next should be fairly obvious. Later age at marriage tends to mean lower fertility, and births to unmarried or not yet married mothers fail to make up for the decline. So just because older women are marrying, people are marrying older, women are marrying older, they're less fertile, less able to have kids, and that gap is not being made up by single women or younger single women. So in Asia, while non-marital fertility is extremely low, so it's very unusual to have single mothers in Asia, but marital fertility is also unusually low. So the low birth rates in Asia could not be explained by stigmatization of non-marital births. As I said, the connection between marriage and fertility went both ways. Married women were more likely to become mothers, and unmarried mothers were more likely to marry, but marriage itself is declining. Pew Research reported in June 2023 that a record high proportion of 40-year-old Americans have never been married. Not surprisingly, they reported only a few months earlier that today's parents rank getting married and having children near the bottom of importance for their offspring, below being financially independent or having a career they enjoy. Offering economic incentives are probably going to be meaningless to a young woman who doesn't have a partner, a potential husband and father. This is what I mentioned from Pew Research. And by 2018, a record high of adults between 25 and 50 had never been married. It rose from 9% in 1970 to 35%, so quadrupled over these almost 5 decades, never been married. Another Pew study asking parents how important these things are for their children. Extremely or very important. 88% said be financially independent, 88% have jobs or careers they enjoy. And this is what's so discouraging. Only 21% of parents in the US felt it was important for their kids to get married or to have children. So what do you expect when the parents who have raised this youngest generation didn't consider it important or a priority? The children are simply living out what they've been taught. And marriage itself has been changed. It used to be so easy, but Mark Regnerus and others, and I talk about a lot of these elements in the talk I gave to ICMDA last year on the top 10 myths of the sexual revolution. I address this issue that marriage has become a trophy. We call it the capstone view of marriage. In earlier generations, it was the foundational view. People got married young, so early 20s. They built a home together. They built a life together. They raised children. They grew in their careers. Now it's viewed that you have to do all that beforehand. Many in the West, and this is spreading throughout the world, feel like before you get married, you have to be established in your career. You have to be financially secure. And for many, there's this pressure of having to fund extravagant weddings. All of these make marriage seem very expensive and seem to put it out of the reach of a large segment of the population, especially the lower income. And as I mentioned, anything that makes marriage less likely is going to reduce fertility. Anything that postpones marriage is going to reduce fertility. Look at this trend now. Mean age of women at the birth of first child. Spain, Italy, Ireland, Greece, over 30. So they're having your first child. the average age now is over 30 and just barely under 30 in most of the remaining nations. And this is quite an issue because fertility does decline with age. They may want to have 2 or 3 or 4 or more children, but the chances of them having it are significantly reduced. What are the odds of pregnancy? Well, less than 30. The odds of pregnancy within 12 months are 85%. By the age 30, only 75%, declines to 66% by 35 and to 44% by 40. So the older they get, the harder it is to get pregnancy and less likely that they are going to be able to have those children. So delaying marriage till 30 or older is a very bad strategy if you're hoping to have a certain number of children. So what are the root factors? I'll sum it up here. Hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure, the competing resources and desires, putting recreation and affluence and the enjoyment of the good life ahead of family. And children aren't valued as they once were. I would refer you to Katie Foss and Them Before Us, where they track all the data, how public policy and social trends have been very harmful to the well-being of children, and people tend not to value children as they should and as they have in past generations. Marriage itself is being devalued, and the delayed age of marriage also contributes to that because of declining fertility. So this is my hypothesis. I propose that what we're seeing, this global decline in fertility, is directly a consequence of the sexual revolution. Again, I referred to my talk of a year ago. And women who do not marry are much less likely to have children. And women who marry later in life are much more likely to suffer problematic fertility. To increase birth rates, it's imperative to increase marriage rates and decrease the age of first marriage. And at this point, I really need to make myself very clear because I feel like I've invited a reaction of women who say I'm blaming them, and absolutely I am not blaming the women for this. There is American men in particular, and men throughout the developed world, are in a very sad state of affairs. Again, Mark Regnerus talked in his books published by Oxford Press about cheap sex and how availability of cheap and easy sex is discouraging men from pursuing marriage or making it as if they don't even have to bother. If they can get sex without marriage, why pay the price? So if I'm blaming women I'm blaming men 10 times more. Okay, let me make that very clear. It takes both sides. Public policy can do very little to affect either one or two. What are one and two? It can do very little affect the age of marriage or the likelihood of people getting married. But cultural messaging is highly effective. It can be for good or can be for bad. A lot of the cultural message is anti-child, anti-marriage, pro-sexual libertinism. So how do we change the discourse? Well, we can challenge the underlying narrative and begin with our own communities and churches. Not everybody's going to listen to us, but at least our own communities, our own churches. And many of these messages are throughout even fairly conservative Bible-believing churches. And at the root of this are beliefs about children, beliefs about the world, beliefs about human sexuality. Beliefs are central to everything. And this is not just a secular war. This is a matter of spiritual warfare because Satan, the enemy, is anti-child, is anti-life, is anti-human, and loves death. Let me close with a passage from Psalms. Children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. Declining fertility and collapsing populations don't act or look like mere economic problems that can be fixed with handouts and tax policies. They reflect a deeper societal malaise where marriage and children are both held in low regard. To reverse population decline requires a complete reversal of priorities and vigorous pushback against the siren song of self-fulfillment. Genuine and long-lasting fulfillment comes from bringing life and happiness to others, as scriptures taught from the beginning. So here's some resources for you, and thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Wow, what an incredible overview. So much data there and so many things that were certainly new to me, and I suspect new to a lot who were listening as well. We've got a time for question and answer now. So just to pick up the first question, and you came back, Stephen, at the end to what the church teaches and does. And Abel Castro is asking, what should the church's role be to avoid or prevent this childless generation? So just to unpack that a little bit more, how can we best teach and model this? Are we falling into the same trap ourselves, I guess, is a big question.
I think what churches can do, especially ones that have a significant membership of single adults, is to be very positive, encouraging to marriage. It seems like maybe inappropriate or intrusive to be the matchmaker, the yenta, but this is a very noble thing. The churches should be helping young women and young men get together and pair up. Challenge some of this messaging. I talked about the capstone view of marriage, that marriage is something that you save until you're established in life, in your career, financially. That's not intuitively wrong. Doesn't sound like a moral issue, but it has bad consequences by pushing back the age of marriage. Delayed marriage not only means lower fertility, it also means that much more likely to end up sexually active before marriage. So promote marriage within the church, encourage marrying at younger ages, and be very positive towards children, be very supportive of families. But I would say, first and foremost, promoting marriage and promoting it earlier rather than later.
Yeah. Thank you. Vinod Shah, who is my predecessor as the CEO of ICMDA from India, is asking, is the fear of divorce a factor? Are people seeing the damage caused by divorce and thinking, I don't want to go there?
I don't know of any data on that. Intuitively, I would say it might be true for a very small number of people. For people who grew up in very troubled families, it might be more of an emotional factor, but it's just one factor of many. I think, again, I just keep going back to Regnerus, and the sex drive in males is extremely strong. And I just reviewed a doctoral dissertation from a friend of mine who looked at marital hesitancy in Black men, and he attributed it mostly to fear. But and that's probably one side of the ledger. But I think if most of all of these men were finding outlets for their sexual desires, and I think if that was not available, I think maybe they would find the motivation to overcome their fears if sex wasn't so readily available. It probably is, but I'm really of the mind that there are many, many factors here. Anybody who says it's just one thing is probably going to be wrong. I think some factors are more important, more significant maybe than others.
Yeah. Now, it was striking the map you showed on fertility at the beginning, and essentially we had the Western world, the Americas, had very low fertility, former Soviet Union, similarly Oceania, but the highest levels were in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Muslim world, in particularly the Middle East region that showed up on your map. Why aren't we seeing the same trends there, or are we? And is it just delayed? What's the data on that?
It's more the latter. Yes, we are, and it's delayed. Certainly, more religious communities are kind of pushing against the grain here. So Israel's so small they don't even show up on the map, but it's a fairly religious population that has a very high birth rate. In the U.S., religious conservatives have higher birth rates. The flip side, I mentioned that older childless women were likely to be politically liberal. So they're also going to be culturally and religiously liberal or secular. So religious areas are going to have higher population. But I think this is spreading across Africa. I think you probably have a lot of people who are listeners who have firsthand knowledge of this. I've been associated with Tenuic Hospital for many years, and you're seeing more young women go into medicine and professions, and some of their lives are following a career track similar to US, where they end up not marrying. So it's probably going to take hold. It's probably going to see the same trends, but it may be decades. I don't know. I'll be around to know whether that happens or doesn't happen.
Sure. Mark Chetter is raising this question about women's education, perhaps a tricky question. I teach at a Christian college, he says. Over 53% of the students are young women. Are we failing this generation of women by emphasizing education over marriage and children?
Well, I don't think any of us feels like it has to be one or the other. And, there's a lot of talk now about how men are falling behind through declining college enrollments. But this came up in an article I saw a couple of years ago when I drilled into the data and found out that the level of male enrollment in college is actually held fairly steady for decades. What we've seen is not a decline in male enrollment, but explosion in female enrollment. And some of that, it's very complicated. How can I possibly answer this in a soundbite? A lot of women go to college because it's the default thing to do, and many are committed to career paths, say in medicine or law, but many just go because it's the thing to do. And many of these end up in college majors that are not particularly helpful. So, and conversely, that we don't have men in college isn't necessarily a bad thing, because there are other ways to set out on a career. In the US, it's a very bad model because so much is college-based, whereas my understanding is in Germany, there are a lot of trade schools teaching men professions that don't require college education. It's maybe a much better way to train our young adult males. But in terms of just women getting an education, no, I don't think that should be regarded as a negative at all. And I guess we could even maybe lighten up a little, saying that maybe colleges, especially Christian colleges, would be a great way for young men and women to get together and pair up. That's how it used to happen.
Yeah, fascinating. What about the role of technology? Just an anecdote, but I was recently in the US, and we celebrated US Thanksgiving, which was great, first time for us. And we the day after, we went out to have lunch with an Amish family, a nuclear family, but with mother and father, 12 kids, 59 grandchildren, and only half of the 12 children were married. Is there a link? Is it partly our obsession with technology that contributes to us having much smaller families, I wonder, and therefore pursuing perhaps different career paths as well that don't depend so much upon having children to support you?
Well, probably not the technology per se. And this is something that instinctively shows up, and it's for different reasons. One, just the distraction. People get sucked up in their virtual lives. They get sucked up in social media or video games, and that takes them out of circulation. So they're not meeting other young people of the opposite sex. It also decreases their socialization, so they don't develop the social skills that are needed to develop healthy, long-term heterosexual relationships. But I think technology is double. I mean, there are more aspects to that, because it's also the chief means by which this negative messaging gets passed on. So I think technology is sort of a part of many of these aspects, less so being an issue by itself, but it's certainly in part of the problem.
Yes, and it's, I guess it's both about medium and the messaging too, isn't it? And
Oh,
Paul Gerhard
oh.
Reinhardt is asking, is feminism an issue? Has it is what's the evidence about that? Has feminism spread a distrust between men and women, discouraging them from marriage?
Well, first wave feminism, starting in the 18th century, equal rights, equal legal protection, legal votes, property rights. No. Second wave feminism, the offspring of Simone de Beauvoir, that erase all distinctions between male and female, placing women in the victim role, railing against men and stirring animosity against men. That's more problematic. And then, of course, third wave feminism, the Judith Butler, Michel Foucault trend, it's toxic, but it really, the answer depends on which kind of feminism you're talking about.
Sure, no, that makes good sense. Now, you talked about the pivotal role of the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s and the fall in fertility or the fertility rate since then. And you've talked about the choices that people make, but has infertility, as opposed to choosing not to have children, played a role? And if so, how much, and what are the main drivers of that or the causes of that infertility?
You probably should direct that more towards someone who specializes in women's health. All I know is what the data has shown. Off the top of my head, I know no particular reason why, your average 21-year-old woman today would be any less fertile than one of 50 years ago. But as they get older, if marriage is pushed out, then the natural physiologic decline in fertility is going to become a factor. Now, I know there are things that get passed around in the news media and the scientific publications that maybe there's decreasing sperm counts, but maybe there are other medical issues, and I just don't feel like I'm up to addressing that. It's out there. I don't know. It doesn't seem to be doesn't seem like it could be a major factor when you have really big, obvious answers. Like Occam's razor, choose the solution which is simplest and requires the least assumptions. And the declining marriage rates and the increased age of marriage combined with natural decline in fertility is the most obvious, straightforward answer to it. But I don't know.
Yeah. And you mentioned that there's quite a difference between different countries in terms of what has reduced the number of children. Whether it is, as you said, in China, the one-child policy, or in Japan and Korea, where contraception, abortion played a big part. Is there a lot of regional difference with these things, or are they more global patterns that we're seeing?
Well, I think globally it really tracks with the spread of this kind of Western post-Christian view of sexuality and this post-Christian Western worldview. It tracks very much with that. I mean, Europe was ahead of the US in, say, theological liberalism and, kind of rejection of Christian teachings on marriage and family, or not necessarily outright rejection, but apathy. And they were ahead. They were equally ahead of the US in declining birth rates and declining fertility. So it tracks very well with the spread of this post-Christian Western secular worldview, which I would say incorporates the basic tenets of the sexual revolution.
Yeah, fascinating. I know in Korea is now the second country after the US in terms of the number of missionaries being sent abroad per church. But your figures were striking about the fall in fertility there. And it's striking also that the number of people actually attending church in South Korea has peaked and is now well on the way down. And, that tends to fit with that same pattern as well. Yeah.
That does look like a missed opportunity if all these young people in church could have been educated in the foundations of building a marriage, of getting married, of building a family, and learning to relate to the opposite sex. We've sort of lost sight of a target.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Sadly, we've run out of time, Stephen, but and we're only really just getting going. There are more questions, and you've really opened our eyes to the issues here, and particularly with all of the data that you've marshaled, which have really got us thinking about this. So it just remains to me to say thank you so much, Stephen, again, for your time, and particularly your time in preparation, for being at the cutting edge of these issues. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks for joining us at ICMDA webinars. God bless you.